Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the third chapter in the book of Exodus, and the experience described therein is of pivotal significance, not only for Moses, but by connection, all of Judaism, and by all connection, all Christianity. Now, in this chapter, we read of, among other things, the mission of Moses and the name of Yahweh, and we're going to comment that on each more extensively as the discourse develops. But for now, it suffices to say that the 120-year life of Moses can be conveniently and neatly categorized into periods of equal length. So the first 40 years of his life he spent in Egyptian royalty. Long story short, by issue of the reigning pharaoh, the Hebrew population who was already enslaved was to be the firstborn of every Hebrew marriage was to be murdered. And so Moses's mother sends him on a basket down the river, and who notices him but Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts him and raises him for his own. Then he learns of his Hebrew identity, and he visits his people and notices an Egyptian slave master abusing one of his people, so he actually murders him, and that sends him on the road. So for the next 40 years of his life, he spends as a shepherd in Midian, and the object lessons are manifest in the shepherd's craft. It was very much analogous to a leadership role in any spiritually significant office. And the final 40 years of his life are the Exodus, and we read of that more extensively throughout the remainder of the Pentateuch, but for now we're going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "And Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the backs of the wilderness, and came to Horeb, the mountain of Elohim." So as we already mentioned, he was at this point in his life, a shepherd, and more specifically for the flock of Jethro, who was the father-in-law of his Midian wife. Now, the Midianites also had Abrahamic descendants, so they may have had a conception of Yahweh or Elohim, but not the fullness of, and they certainly weren't selected for the special mission that Israel was appointed for. But we can imagine that their religion was less maligned and polluted than the majority of the neighboring nations. And Horeb is alternately a site of spiritual significance, and it is identified as the mountain of Elohim. "And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked and saw the bush burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed." So this is by every definition a miracle. A miracle by definition describes an event or an experience in which the ordinary operations of natural laws are defied, transcended, or superseded. So this is made possible because the one who controls matter and the laws of physics was able to suspend those laws, whereby a bush would be inflamed but not consumed. Now, the flame, by law of nature, consumes all that it touches, but this was a theophanic manifestation, and so the bush was not burned. "And Moses said, 'Let me turn aside now, and let me see this great sight, why the bush does not burn.'" So there's no indication that at least by inference of the passage itself, that he was aware of the divine presence, but the miraculous nature of the sight is going to lead him there. "And Yahweh saw that he had turned aside to see, and Elohim called to him from the midst of the bush, and said, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" So he just found out directly and explicitly that Yahweh was revealing himself to him in a visible form, and his response is, "Here I am." That is a standard response to the divine majesty, which calls one out. We witness a similar pattern and formula. I believe Samuel says something similar, and as does Isaiah. "And he said, 'Do not come near here. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is sacred ground.'" So his presence automatically sanctifies wherever it is, and by his presence, the sandals are deemed unfit to walk in such proximity to his presence. So anywhere he is, the location is automatically and fully sanctified. And he said, I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So after introducing himself as the Elohim of the patriarchs of the Jewish people, Moses is succumbed by fear to look, because it's caught up to him at this moment that he is in the midst of a superior being, and it is frightful and terrible to behold him. And we ourselves are never privy to such an open revelation, so we can imagine that the sight which he held in the burning fire and the angel was a sight which inspired fear. And Yahweh said, I have indeed seen the oppression of my people, who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their slave drivers. For I know their sorrows. So after an extended period of around 400 years, the Israelites who had inherited the worship of Elohim and from their patriarchs had cause to question if they had been forsaken, because the life of the slave was all they knew, and they were historically embedded as an enslaved class. But Yahweh is his delays are not his denials, and he's going to manifest them and liberate them for a great purpose. And he feels our pain, so even though pain can isolate us into the erroneous conception that no one knows what we're feeling, the Elohim imminently enters all of our pains and sorrows and discomforts. And I have come down to deliver them from the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hiwanites, and the Jebusites. So he's declaring to him frankly his intention to displace Israel, which had grown as a nation within a nation of Egypt, to settle their own nation. Now that they had the size and population to settle a nation, they were in turn going to displace the Canaanites, which in general terms describes the indigenous inhabitants of the Promised Land. More specifically and literally, they were a descendant of one of Noah's grandsons through Ham, and the various Hittites, Amorites, etc., were various nations which coexisted in the same geographical terrain. They were of various origins, but they were in all cases of Semitic stock, being descended. Most of them were descended from Shem, the son of Noah. And now, see, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. So once more, the cry of Israel, they had cried up to the sky, seemingly no answer for hundreds of years, but he's assuring Moses that he was in fact aware of their pains and travails, and enough was enough. They had endured the trial of affliction in the furnace of the affliction, and they were to be liberated for a greater purpose. And now come, I am sending you to Pharaoh, to bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So Moses would have been aware of Pharaoh. He may have been his stepbrother at one point, and so he was an intimidating presence. Now, in his proximity to the throne of Egypt, he would have been aware of its power, and he didn't quite belong because he wasn't quite Egyptian, and his identity crisis was one of being too Egyptian for the Hebrews and too Hebrew for the Egyptians. But he finally finds himself out in the wilderness and lays hold to his destiny. And Moses said to Elohim, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So Moses is looking at himself rather than looking above him, and Yahweh often commands us to do difficult things, but we are never bereft of his company inasmuch as we embark on his purposes. So Moses is humbly aware of his own weaknesses, infirmities, and limitations, but at the same time he is uniquely positioned amongst the Hebrew people because none other would have been familiar with the protocols and customs of court life, and that enabled him to gain access to the Pharaoh to petition him on behalf of his people, and the details of those dialogues manifest throughout the remaining narrative of the book of Exodus. And he said, "Because I am with you, and this is to you the sign that I have sent to you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you are to serve Elohim on this mountain." So that's a date with destiny, so he assures him that he will return to this very location in the company of a newly liberated nation of people, and that will be a sign, and that's a promise. And Moses said to Elohim, "See, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they say to me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" So the name of Elohim was at this point a mystery, and throughout various locations of history, the sacred name of Yahweh ceases to exist. We read of it in Genesis 4:26, the original instance where the name of Yahweh began to be called upon again. But during this lapse in their enslavement, they had the name had discontinued among them, but here it is henceforth once more revived for Moses. And we have to understand that the Genesis accounts was written by Moses, so throughout he is the author of them, and throughout he employs the terminologies of Elohim and Yahweh. And Elohim said to Moses, "I am that which I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" So "I am that which I am" literally translates as Yahweh, the sacred name by which we know Elohim the Father. And the names are of more than merely symbolic significance to the Hebrew people. They indicated a function to be fulfilled. So in Yahweh's case, his name speaks of his eternal self-existence. He's always been, always will be, and his power will remain undiminished, and the power does not cease in the absence of the knowledge of that name, as it has for some time in Christianity, recently revived by the sacred name movement. But the names of the alternate rival deities of the pagan polytheistic pantheons have been reduced to knowledge almost exclusively limited to a scholarly minority, but the name of Yahweh does endure, and nothing and no one can take that away from him or us. And Elohim said further to Moses, "Thus you are to say to the children of Israel, 'Yahweh Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, and the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my remembrance to all generations.'" So it is an eternally binding name, and it existed since the antedation of creation. And he is instructed to inform his people to provide the answer to the question he asked. He was to go, so it wasn't an unrighteous request, it was a legitimate concern, because he was mindful that the mystery of the name would diminish his credibility, but if he had the name intact, he would gain credibility amongst the people. And remembrance to all generations, there's various passages in the Old Testament, Hosea 10:5, Psalm 133, 13, that speak of the remembrance to all generations, that reiterate the language. "Go, and you shall gather the elders of Israel together, and say to them, 'Yahweh Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have indeed visited you, and seen what is done to you in Egypt.'" So, as far as the nation of Israel was concerned, Yahweh had forgotten them and forsaken them, but Moses is instructed to reassure them that he was mindful of their pains, and enough was enough, and they had a greater future they had one to be hopeful for and look forward to. I say, I am bringing you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hiwanite, and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. So that's an essential reiteration of the 8th verse. No additional commentary is needed, we feel. And they shall listen to your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, Yahweh Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, to slaughter to Yahweh our Elohim. So this is the instructed verbal formula he's to present to the king of Egypt, which would have been Pharaoh. Now, the king of Egypt was known by a variety of titles, which seem to us, from our Republican sensibilities, ostentatious and superfluous, but the name which has survived posterity is in fact Hebrew in origin. It roughly translates as Great House. So that is, now the Egyptians would have known him by not necessarily Pharaoh, but the terminology which has gained currency in the English language is Hebrew in origin. But he's instructed to give orders, essentially, of defiance to an absolute monarch whose authority was uncontested, yet he was very much subjected to the sovereign Elohim and creator of the heaven and earth. But I know that the king of Egypt is not going to let you go, not even by a strong hand. So he's aware of the hardened heart of the Pharaoh, which will not be amenable to persuasion by the word of Elohim, but will ultimately rescind by the works of Elohim. So Elohim and Yahweh is speaking to Pharaoh through his mouthpiece of Moses. He's warned in advance that it will be rejected, but Yahweh still speaks by other measures, and those are the 10 plagues which visit his land, which ultimately compels him to relent. But even witnessing the escaped nation within a nation who were economically essential to the operation of Egypt, he ultimately chases them to his own doom. And I shall stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I shall do in its midst. And after that he shall let you go. So he knows in advance that he's not going to be initially persuaded to voluntarily forsake an entire class of slaves, yet the wonders and the 10 plagues of Egypt are incidentally indictments of 10 of the deities of Egypt, whereby their mastery is manifestly inferior to the miracle maker of authentic miracles. And I shall give this people grace in the eyes of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you shall not go empty-handed. So by the time that Yahweh's done with these people, they will be so glad that the Hebrews are leaving that they're going to give them stuff to aid them on their journey. So the Hebrews did not leave empty-handed, but in fact carried much of the treasure of Egypt, which was one of the wealthiest nations of the ancient world, in hand. But every woman shall ask from her neighbor, and from the stranger in her house, objects of silver, and objects of gold, and garments, and you shall put them on your sons, and on your daughters, and shall plunder the Egyptians. So not only are they going to leave and liberate themselves, but they're going to plunder them, and not by any violence, but by simple ask, and their request will be immediately and thoroughly accommodated. So they do have a lot to look forward to. I know life is tough right now for the Hebrews. They're under backbreaking labor in the hot Egyptian sun, but life will get better. So no matter what juncture or detour you find yourselves at life, there is always a hope for a greater future, if not in this world, then certainly in the next. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.